Good afternoon, my name's Ewan Gordon. I'm the Provincial Grand Orator for Buckinghamshire, and to introduce myself I must first tell you what I do. The Provincial Grand Orator job is to promote and encourage the daily Masonic advancement of all Freemasons and within Freemason lodges within the province. In particular, it's to promote a website called Solomon. Solomon is a United Grand Lodge website. You can find it at solomon.ugle.org.uk. And if you haven't already been on Solomon, you'll find that you need to enrol, give yourself a password and a username. And you can then log on there, and you need to enrol on the different chapters within the website. There is a chapter on every Masonic degree, the Holy Royal Arch. There is also a chapter, a very interesting chapter, on Masonic history. This particular oration, and this is the first of my orations as the Provincial Grand Orator, is entitled A Brief History of Freemasonry, and it can be found in the Masonic History chapter. I hope you enjoy this. I'm hoping to do these presentations once a month. I had intended to record the Zoom presentation. Unfortunately, my technology failed me, so I've had to do this as separate. But I certainly will be recording these and distributing them around the province. So, brethren, a brief history of Freemasonry. Freemasonry is the world's oldest and largest fraternal organisation with over 5 million members worldwide. It does not cause conflict between Freemasons and their families or friends over religious or political beliefs. It requires candidates for membership to be over 18 years of age, to be of a good moral character, and to believe in the existence of a supreme being. It is a society for men and women concerned with maintaining moral and spiritual values and the search for wisdom, brotherhood and charity. The precise origins of Freemasonry are unknown, although there are many theories going back as far as the 12th century with the formation of the Knights Templar, or back to the Old Testament era and the building of King Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, or the ancient Egypt and the construction of the pyramids, although it's pure conjecture rather than evidence. When the first Grand Lodge of England was formed in 1717, a diligent search was made for the documents about the practice, legends, customs, laws and regulations of the medieval operative stonemasons, generally seen as the precursors to modern speculative Freemasonry. Many old charges and constitutions were found, which outlined a history of Masonry tracing its origins to biblical and classical roots. The old charges were documents describing the duties of the members, which every Mason had to swear to uphold an initiation. For this reason, every lodge had a copy of the charges, occasionally written on the first pages of the minute book, but more usually on a separate manuscript or scroll. After the foundation of the Grand Lodges of England, these were largely superseded by printed books of constitution, but the Grand Lodge of all England at York and a few independent lodges in Scotland and Ireland retained the handwritten charges as their authority to meet. More than a century after the formation of the Premier Grand Lodge in 1717, the Regius poem or manuscript was rediscovered. It is the oldest existing Masonic manuscript, written about 1390, when King Richard II was on the throne, before the Wars of the Roses, and over a century before the first voyage of Columbus to the New World. In the Middle Ages, the artisans who worked stone for use in the buildings were, like other artisans, organised into guilds, which could be seen as the precursors of modern professional bodies or trade unions. The guilds were permitted to make and enforce their own rules, and were given a monopoly of the work done inside their territory. The guilds, representing builders or stonemasons, were usually more important than the others because their work by their members was more difficult and required a higher degree of skill. Operative stonemasons were often in great demand and often travelled away from their homes for long periods. This led them to erecting temporary buildings known as lodges, close to their construction site where they worked, where they could eat, sleep and hold site meetings. Part of their guild dues was paid in a common purse to pay alms to members unable to work due to sickness or infirmity, or to pay alms to widows and children and funeral expenses. The art of building at that time was held as a trade secret, only to be revealed by those who had proved their skill. Therefore, the young apprentices entered the guild, took oaths, never to divulge the secrets of their craft. These secrets are handed down from father to son and from master to apprentice within the guild. Relatively few changes were made to operative lodge practices and beliefs in the 300 years between the reigns of King Richard II and King George I, who died in 1727. From the late 17th century, the power and influence of the operative stonemasons and their guilds went into decline, and they began to accept non-operative members, known as speculative Freemasons, who were often well-educated men who used the operatives' traditional practices as basis of philosophy of self-improvement. Whereas the operative stonemasons had used tools to build physical buildings, the speculative Freemasons used the tools symbolically to develop themselves as spiritual buildings. The skill of the architects to construct a building according to a design was ascribed by the speculative Freemasons to God, whom they named the great architect of the universe. The speculative Freemasons also developed the operative symbolism and allegory, developed in an era when most people were illiterate, as a way of passing on traditions and values to symbolize philosophical ideas and virtues. The earliest written evidence of the admission of speculative Freemasons to an operatives' lodge is Edward Conder's Records of the Holy Craft and Fellowship of Masons, which states that 6 men were so admitted to a lodge in 1620. Another well-known early speculative Freemasonry was Elias Ashmole, who went on to found the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. On the 16th of October 1646 he was initiated at a lodge in Warrington that was mostly composed of speculative Masons. These early speculative Freemasons would have had an understanding of mathematics and geometry, which went beyond that used in the building trade, to encompass navigation and astronomy. They sought knowledge, kept their trade secrets, and were committed to mutual protection and support. Incidentally, there are several theories as to the origin of the term Freemason. Freemasons were originally stonemasons who worked in free stone, that is, stone ready and hewn and shaped for the building, in contrast to the rough stone straight from the quarry. They were paid more than the quarrymen or rough masons. Stonemasons became known as Freemasons because they were exempt from many of the tiresome feudal duties required of medieval labourers and peasants, and because they enjoyed these liberties, such as the right to travel and exemption from military service. There were 2 types of Masonic Masons guilds in the Middle Ages: those for Masons who always worked in a particular town or city, and those for free Masons employed on large, usually ecclesiastical buildings projects, who were allowed to move wherever they were to get the work, and were considered superior to local Masons. At the beginning of the 18th century, there appears to have been a predominance of purely speculative lodges in the south of England, with operative and mixed lodges still the majority in the north and in Scotland. The modern organisational structure of Freemasonry in England dates back to the founding of the Premier Grand Lodge of England in 1717. Its basic principles were inspired by the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, a cultural movement of intellectuals in the 17th and 18th centuries which sought to reform society using reason to challenge ideas grounded in tradition and religion, and to advance knowledge using scientific deduction. It promoted scientific thought, scepticism, and intellectual interchange, and opposed superstition, intolerance, and the abuse of power by the Church and the State. At this time, the Grand Lodge was limited jurisdiction over the small number of lodges in London and Westminster. Its foundation was agreed by representatives of 4 lodges at a meeting at the Apple Tree Tavern in Covent Garden, and its first meeting was held at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern in St Paul's Churchyard on the 24th of June 1717. The Grand Lodge's jurisdiction over lodges outside London spread in the 18th century through the formation of Provincial Grand Lodges, each with a Provincial Grand Master, the first of which was appointed for Cheshire in 1725. In 1751, a group of Irish Masons in London formed a rival Grand Lodge to the Premier Grand Lodge, which they claimed had departed from the ancient landmarks. This led to the supporters of a breakaway Grand Lodge being dubbed Ancients, while supporters of the Premier Grand Lodge were dubbed the Moderns. Neither Grand Lodge recognised the other's affiliated lodges of Masons as regular Freemasons. By early 19th century, the Grand Masters of the two rival lodges were royal brothers, both sons of King George III, and negotiations began to unite the two Grand Lodges. This resulted in the creation of the United Grand Lodge of England, UGLE, in 1813. A special Lodge of Reconciliation was formed to devise a new ritual that was acceptable to everyone, and this was published in June 1816. From the creation of the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813, Freemasonry continued to thrive. And by the early years of the 20th century, Freemasons were very, very visible in part of their local community, and they were well known for their charitable and philanthropic work. Public processions of Freemasons in their regalia were common, and the men were proud to be Freemasons and to be seen publicly as Freemasons. However, the fascist and national politicians who rose to power in the 1930s in many countries in Europe demonised Jews and Freemasons alike as members of an underground international conspiracy. In Germany, Italy and Russia, and then occupied Europe, Freemasons were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, where we believe between 80,000 and 200,000 of them were killed. After the end of the Second World War, German plans for a mass arrest and imprisonment of Freemasons and other minorities in Britain were discovered, and that which would have been implemented had the invasion gone ahead. The Nazis hated the idea of democracy and humanity that were inherent in Freemasonry, and the idea of a general association of mankind without the distinction of race, religion, or social and political conviction, especially for those indoctrinated in the Nazi ideals of German national supremacy over so-called inferior races. They likewise saw Freemasonry as a source of resistance to their concept of world domination, and so Freemasonry had to be destroyed. For British Freemasons, this persecution in other countries caused relatively little concern at first, but by the early 1930s, they were being told of the persecution of foreign brethren and realised they could be next. And as a result, they became very much more secretive about their organisation and their own membership. This meant no more public appearances, no more Masonic news columns in newspapers, no more public Masonic Foundation stone-laying ceremonies, and a reluctance by Freemasons to talk about Freemasonry. This attitude persisted after 1945 and gave rise to a host of conspiracy theories and a fear of sinister secret societies that continues in some circles to this present day. In 1984, in an attempt to dispel these damaging myths, the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England officially announced a new policy of openness that would see Freemasons Hall in London and many other Masonic lodges open to the public. In addition, Freemasons Hall was rented out for fashion shoots, conferences and filming. Grand Lodge and the provinces appointed media representatives, and senior Grand Lodge officers gave television, radio and newspaper interviews. Today, most lodges hold open days, social events and dinners which are open to non-members. And many have stands at county shows and university freshers' fairs to publicise their charitable work and recruit new members. Online, there are many lodge and order websites, discussion forums and Facebook groups. One reason for this change of policy, characterised by the Enough is Enough campaign, is to counter the persistent claims that Freemasonry is a secret world order, one which controls the politics and finances of every country across the globe for our own personal gain, twists the judicial system to allow criminal Freemasons to escape justice, and feathers his own nest at the expense of the rest of society. Although we may laugh at some of these ridiculous accusations, which seem to have changed little since the 1930s, many believe them, and questions are still being asked by MPs in Parliament. Pressure on Jack Straw MP, the Labour Home Secretary, led him to introduce legislation in 1999 that obliged all judges, police officers, probation officers and prison officers to declare their membership of Freemasonry, amid fears that a Masonic mafia was perverting the course of justice. The legislation was repealed in 2009 without anyone being prosecuted, and following upon the Grand Secretary's appearance before the Home Affairs Select Committee, he called for evidence of any impropriety by Freemasons to be made public, but none could be found. This legislation was also scrapped on legal advice that the government would lose a challenge brought by United Grand Lodge before the European Court of Human Rights. There can be no doubt that the charitable giving by Freemasons across our communities, the country and internationally stands us in good stead with our fellow citizens. Indeed, Freemasons are one of the largest charitable donors in the UK. Masonic charitable foundations fund schools, almshouses, care homes and university scholarships. The United Grand Lodge of England currently has over 200,000 members, meeting in nearly 7,000 lodges in England and Wales. Scotland, Ireland have their own Grand Lodges. Lodges meeting in London, an area generally within a 10-mile radius of Freemasons Hall, are administered by the Metropolitan Grand Lodge of London, which is headed by the Metropolitan Grand Master. Lodges meeting outside London and within England, Wales, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands are grouped into 47 provinces whose boundaries often correspond with the old pre-1974 counties, each headed by a Provincial Grand Master. Lodges that meet outside England, Wales, Ireland and Channel Islands are grouped into 33 districts, each headed by a District Grand Master. 5 groups, currently too small to make up a district, are headed by Grand Inspectors, and 12 lodges abroad are currently administered from Freemasons Hall in London. United Grand Lodge of England recently commissioned its first ever independent study entitled The Future of Freemasonry by a non-Masonic institution, the Social Issues Research Centre. The study suggests that, contrary to some misleading media comments, Freemasonry demonstrates genuine openness and transparency, and is arguably more relevant today than ever. In particular, it found that Freemasonry acts as a constant, often providing members with a unique combination of friendship, belonging and structure, and with Masons saying that they have made more valuable lifelong friendships. It also highlights the importance that Freemasonry places on charitable giving, the part that many Freemasons play in their local communities, the central role of the family, and its instilling in its members a moral and ethical approach to life. This includes thoughtfulness for others, kindness in the community, honesty in business, courtesy in society and fairness in all things. Thus, it is clear that Freemasonry has an important part to play in the future of our society by building friendships, providing a sense of belonging, and maintaining moral standards and supporting charities. Brethren, that ends that oration. This oration, as I say, can be found in Solomon. That's solomon.ugle.org.uk. Please log on to that, and you can find this oration and many others in the Masonic History chapter. I will be around the province. I will be trying to make as many installation meetings as possible to meet all the brethren. But I shall also be doing another oration. I'm hoping to do one once a month, and I'll be concentrating on the first degree. And in particular, the next one will be around the first degree charge. Now, for our newer brethren, that is, the charge is the large piece at the end of the initiation ceremony. After you've gone out and reclothed yourself and you've come back in, the charge after initiation is always presented at an initiation ceremony to the candidate. We'll be looking at that, we'll be discussing it, and I will be presenting an oration looking into that charge in a little bit more depth. And I look forward to seeing you all then. But for now, have a very pleasant day, and catch up very soon.